Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our teaching on LGBT terminology. Today, we're going to be having a talk presented by Leighton, who is our treasurer. Yeah, do you want to just take it away, Leighton?
Yeah, sure. Hiya, I'm Leighton. I'm the treasurer for this year. Got a PowerPoint on terminology, so let's just sort of get started. It shouldn't take too long. Can you see it okay?
Yeah, I can see it. Funky and green.
Let it start.
It's just loading. Okay, yeah, all good.
There we are. So, to start with, why bother learning the terminology? So, stay with me. In 1953, philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein produced a work titled Philosophical Investigations, in which he introduced and developed his concept of language games. He argued that using language is an action. So in saying things and by using particular language, you're doing something. And that language only has meaning in the context of the game being played. So guided by the rules of the game being played. The point is, words and sentences are given their meaning by the sort of common understanding of the words in the specific context that they're used. He used the example of the word water. So if someone says water, shouts water, it could be an explanation, it could be an order, get me some water. It could be a response to a question, what do you want? That kind of thing. Or, pretty much anything else. But on its own, the word water doesn't really hold any meaning. So why does it matter? So people who are LGBTQ plus are part of a community which has its own language games. We've got our own words and our own sentences and our own sort of broad context language that may not be known by people who aren't part of the community. And that's true for all language. So, the language of English has the meanings of its words given because of the way that we use the language in everyday life. And then communities around English-speaking countries have different words and different meanings for words that have different meanings elsewhere based on the word, the way that they use them in specific places. And the same is true for the LGBTQ plus community. So we can think of words ourselves, so the word like queer. So queer has got a bunch of different reasons depending on the language game being played. So for many people, unfortunately, it's a slur. It's something that a lot of people grow up with and have negative connotations for, because those negative connotations are the rules of that language game. It could refer to sort of dictionary definition of strange or odd, or we can use it to refer to what is kind of commoner as people who are members of the LGBTQ community, which is a much more positive thing. But that doesn't, mean that the other two definitions aren't relevant anymore. For a lot of people, the word queer is too much, it carries too much harm to use normally, because the rules of their language game are different to the rules of our language game. And that's why this is important. So knowing words that the LGBTQ people use to describe themselves lets you in on our language game and establishes a common understanding. It builds a rapport with your patients and develops trust. It ensures that your patients can talk with you openly and honestly, secure in the knowledge that you know what they're talking about. And like we said at the beginning, Wittgenstein says language is an action. When you say something, you're doing something. So when you use and understand language that your patients use with you, you're showing your patient that they can trust you. And I think that's important. So on to the rest of the presentation, the bulk of it. We're going to be talking about common words and phrases, mainly words. Very brief discussion on making practice more inclusive, because we've done that before. And then we're going to have a questions/discussion bit if anyone has any questions to ask. A quick disclaimer before we get into it. Lots of words and phrases don't really have distinct definitions. Lots of different things mean slightly different things to different people. So we're going to be discussing kind of like the overall typical use and kind of trying to acknowledge nuance where we're aware that there is some, and if you're not, sorry, but trying to cover bases. Start with the basics. it's LGBTQ plus terminology. So what does LGBTQ plus mean? So we've got L, lesbian. So it's typically understood as a woman who has exclusive sexual and or romantic attractions to other women. And like you said, this is a nuanced definition. There are non-binary people who refer to themselves as lesbians and that kind of thing. But this is kind of how it's commonly understood. G, gay. Typically understood, again, as a man who has exclusive sexual and or romantic attraction to other men. But as we know, gay is kind of a catch-all term for most people in the LGBTQ plus community in general. So it's not kind of strict definition. And lots of people use it for use it to understand themselves and to define themselves. B, bisexual, typically understood as a person who has sexual and or romantic attraction to two or more other genders. So nowadays, or in the past rather, it was kind of understood that bisexual people are attracted to men and women, and now, growing appreciation is developing that men and women are kind of final discrete categories of gender that we thought they were. And bi doesn't, in this context, doesn't necessarily need to, so it can be two or more. And then T, we've got transgender, which is a person who lives as a gender that is not the same as the gender they're assigned at birth. We'll sort of go over lots more of these definitions later. Q has two different meanings. One is questioning, the other is queer. So questioning is a person who's questioning someone's in the process of determining their sexual orientation or their gender identity, for that matter, or who's questioning the sort of default assumption that they're heterosexual or cisgendered. Whereas a queer person is kind of commonly understood to be someone who's part of the LGBT community in general. And then we've got the plus. So the plus is pretty much any other person that is part of the LGBT plus community. So, the kind of initialism could go on for quite a while. But there are so many different people and types of people in our community that adding the plus kind of helps to encapsulate everyone all together. It includes people who are asexual, aromantic, people who are intersex, people who are pansexual, and more. More basics. One final basic, pronouns. What is a pronoun? There's a word that's used instead of a noun or a noun phrase, for example, he, it, hers, me, them, etc. So it's effectively, they're the words that we use to refer to people instead of using a name. So personal pronouns are the words like you said, the words that we use to refer to them, like he, she, and they. Generally, people's pronouns correspond to gender presentation. So a lot of people feel comfortable saying, give the change to the man, or watch out for the lady as she crosses the road or something. But it's kind of good to not think that's always true. People's gender presentations don't necessarily correspond to their pronouns. Just people's pronouns don't necessarily correspond to their gender. So it's a good idea not to make assumptions. Yeah. So it's safer just to ask. It's good to get into the habit of asking people what pronouns they use, because even if most people who look the way that you'd expect for the people who use the pronouns that they use, there are going to be a fairly decent number of people who don't, and in ignoring them, doing more harm than good. You should just ask. Moving on to sort of sexuality terms. So, first of all, sexual and romantic attractions can be distinct, which is important to keep in mind when talking to patients. So, a romantic attraction is an emotional attraction to somebody, whereas a sexual attraction is kind of a physical attraction to somebody that leads to sexual desire and interaction. These are kind of hard to define because for a lot of people, these cross over a great deal, but there are for some people the distinction is very, very important, and we're going to talk about that a bit more. Next sort of two terms. When you look at public health research, generally you'll see these phrases. So WLW and WSW. So that's women who love women and women who have sex with women. And then we've got MLN and MSN. That's men who love men, men who have sex with men. And I think what's important to appreciate there is that men who have sex with men, men who love men, and women who have sex with women, and women who have love women aren't necessarily the same people. You can love people without having sex with them, or you have romantic attraction without having sexual attraction. And that's important for our patients. So if you're asking somebody if they about like a sexual history, for example, if they have a partner, just because they have a partner doesn't necessarily mean they're having sex. Because they've got a sexual partner doesn't necessarily mean they've got a romantic partner, etc. And then we've got some people don't actually experience any sexual attraction at all, and that would be used to define that as asexual. Some people don't experience any romantic attraction at all, and therefore may identify it as aromantic. But not necessarily. Not everyone who doesn't experience sexual attraction calls themselves asexual, and the other way for aromantic. It's just a word some people use to identify themselves. Then we've got gender terms, which is by far the kind of biggest list. There's a lot of stuff here to define. Starting with what is sex and what is gender. And these are also very, very difficult words to describe, to define, because there's lots of nuance and variability in how we define sex, especially in how we define gender. So we commonly understand sex as the biological distinction of male and female based on reproductive characteristics. But male and female aren't really discrete characteristics, not discrete categories as we're trying to kind of understand more. And if we think about people who are intersex, they don't necessarily fit into either category, and therefore saying that sex is a distinction of two things is just incorrect. That's kind of how we understand it at the moment. Whereas gender is the social component. So it's the various characteristics related to masculinity and femininity, which is completely socially influenced. Fine. So transgender and cisgender are ways of describing how somebody identifies. So if somebody's transgender, it means that they're a person who lives as a gender different to their assigned gender at birth. Whereas if you're cisgender, it means that your gender identity is the same as your assigned gender at birth. So what your assigned gender at birth, or your AGAB, is the gender that an infant is assigned after birth based on sex characteristic. So after your birth, and someone says it's a boy, that's your assigned gender at birth. So if someone says it's a boy, well, that means you're assigned male at birth, or a man. If it's the other way around, and you're assigned female at birth, that's a fad. And I can got the word for the acronyms that we use to remember those: AFAB, AMAB, AGAB. Yeah, like we said just now, intersex, it's some of the sex characteristics, actually primary sex characteristics. And primary sex characteristics are genitals, or they can be genetic, or they can be hormonal, that do not necessarily fit into the distinction of male or female, like I said before. Then we've got gender dysphoria and gender euphoria. So gender dysphoria are feelings of distress, which is quite a disservice to what gender dysphoria is. It can be very, very intense feelings of distress and anxiety that arise or can arise as a result of the mismatch between a person's assigned gender at birth and their gender identity. Our patients, if we see trans patients, will have varying degrees of gender dysphoria, and that will vary throughout their lives and between individuals as well. Some people have really, really, really intense gender dysphoria about particular things. Some people don't have much at all, and some people's kind of alleviates over time or gets worse over time. So it's not kind of it's not an unchanging thing that a person just has. And then gender euphoria, so that's the kind of opposite. So it's feelings of comfort and joy. That can arise when people feel that their gender is affirmed, which is what we want our patients to do. And it's what we can, in making our practice inclusive, which we'll discuss a little bit, can hopefully help our patients to feel. And some more sort of specific definitions. So a transgender or a trans man. So a trans man is a man who is assigned female at birth. Trans woman is a woman who is assigned male at birth. Trans masculine is somebody who was assigned female at birth with a gender identity aligns closer with a masculine identity. So a trans masculine person can be a trans man, but not necessarily. It can be a trans masculine and binary person. For example, trans feminine, so other side. So someone who's assigned male at birth, but their gender identity aligns closely with the feminine identity. And like I said, so trans women are trans feminine, but not all trans feminine people are trans women. We've got non-binary or genderqueer, which kind of mean similar things. So somebody whose gender identity doesn't fit neatly into the category of either man or woman. So you could be a trans masculine non-binary person because you might not identify as a man, but your gender identity fits more into the masculine side of the spectrum than it does the other side. But then you can also just be non-binary without being more towards anything else. And that's kind of the point. So non-binary identities vary massively, and it's important, as with everything else, to not make any assumptions, and only really ask the patients about it if it's relevant. You don't want to just ask them questions about things that don't matter because you're curious. But if it's relevant, you can ask. If not, just make an assumption. And you've got some kind of practical things. So binding is using tight fabrics to wrap the chest to limit the appearance of soft tissue on the chest. Lots of trans masculine people do this because that's an area that can be dysphoric. And this is kind of important for us to be aware of because there are very, very, very unsafe ways to bind. It's relatively recent that kind of safe binding has come into the mainstream, and that binders are sort of readily available, but even then it's not readily as such. And even doing it safely can cause harm over extended periods. So yeah, it's important to be aware of this bit for our patients. And then tucking. So tucking is using tight clover tapes to minimize the appearance of the cleats and the testes. It's not as dangerous, but it's not very comfortable either. And then sort of types of surgery that patients might talk about. So top surgery is a gender affirming operation to remove the soft tissue from the chest, whereas bottom surgery generally refers to sort of genitoplasty. So on the lower body, either changing or sort of changing the shape of the sex organ. So you might do something like a phalloplasty to create a penis or a phallus, or vaginoplasty to create a vagina. Not every trans person gets either surgery. Not every trans person needs to have surgery to for any particular reason. Some people just don't want it, and that's fine. It's just something that you might hear your patients talking about. And then some more things. So we've got transition. When a person changes their gender expression to be more consistent with their gender identity. So you might hear people talking about how when they started their transition. So that's when they started to present more consistently with who they are. And generally it's split into kind of two categories. So you've got a social transition, which is transitioning socially. So taking steps like changing your name, doing things with your hair and your appearance, and that kind of thing. Telling people to use different pronouns to refer to you to be in line with your gender. And then we've got a medical transition. So that's when people start taking hormones or have surgery to develop physical characteristics and a sense of internal well-being that's consistent with their gender identity. On the topic of medical transition, gender-affirming hormone therapy is the kind of catch-all term for taking hormones. It used to be called cross-sex hormone therapy, but and it's still referred to that in many places like the NHS website, but it's not a very preferred way, typically way to talk about it. So gender-affirming hormone therapy. So hormone suspension is taken by some trans people to induce physical changes that are more consistent with the gender identity. And this can be in the form of injections or patches or gels or pills sometimes. But it varies between what hormones you're taking and what is practical for you as the patient and that kind of thing. Hormones, T, people talk about T, it's testosterone used by some transmasculine people to induce masculine characteristics, secondary sex characteristics. So growing a beard, body fat redistribution, the deepening of the voice, etc. And then E, used by some trans feminine people to induce feminine secondary characteristics, like chest, soft tissue development, and soft skin, and that kind of thing. It's called the E and not the O because in America it's spelled without the O, so it's just easier to call it. Everyone calls it E. Most trans people will be either aiming to start hormones or taking hormones, but not everyone does. And transition looks different for everybody. It's not, it's not important for us to know the ins and outs of our patient's transition journey or transition goals unless we're the doctor or healthcare professional in charge of the medical aspects of their transition or otherwise. But yeah, if it is relevant, it tends to be relevant. And that's kind of it for the language. Appreciate that there's a lot there. But yeah, a very brief kind of bit about inclusive practice. So talks a bit about pronouns. When you feel safe to do so, try and produce the pronouns, the anti-patient pronouns that you use. So I'm an Clayton, I'm a extra medical student or something else again. I don't know. I use pronouns he, they, or I use he, they pronouns. What's your name and what your pronouns, and how would you like me to refer to you and what pronouns we'd like to use, etc. Those kind of things. I like we've kind of just gone over a bit. Think about how necessary it is for you to know the ins and outs of your patient's identity. Like, are you just being curious? Are you asking, sort of expecting them to teach you things? Have you not seen a trans person before and you're really, really curious about what being a trans person is like? And think of, is it appropriate for you to ask a patient this question? Right. We've got trans broken arm syndrome. So the idea is it's a kind of allegory for how trans people's health problems tend to be blamed on the fact that they're trans and not the fact that they've got health problems. So, a trans person comes in with a broken arm and all of a sudden it's their hormones fault or it's the fault of the fact that they're trans or whatever. So, remember that your patients are still people with normal medical things, and just because they're trans, it doesn't really mean anything necessarily, unless it does mean anything, in which case that doesn't apply. It probably doesn't. And then lastly, be careful with making assumptions, and that's kind of across the board, but especially when taking sexual history. So if you're talking to a man who talks about sex that he has with his partner, don't assume that because he's a man he's having sex with a woman. Instead ask him, what kind of sex he's having, or what the sex of his sexual partners are, or how many sexual partners he has before going into using partners as a plural word, that kind of thing. But also remember, we kind of touched on it earlier, that some people just don't like sex. If someone says, yeah, I have a boyfriend at home, don't just assume that they've got a sexual relationship, because they might not. And that's fine. Yeah, and that's kind of the very brief stuff that I wanted to mention. Right. Do we have any questions to finish up with? And also thanks for listening.
Thanks, Leighton. That was really good. I don't have any questions, but I do have something that I want to add. Is that okay? So if you go back to the previous slide about inclusive.
Yes.
You know how you were saying trans broken arm syndrome, and then in the slide before that you were saying about it's not really relevant to know the medical transition unless you're directly responsible for the medical side of that transition. But I suppose it is a question to you as well. Is there any situation where the hormones that they're taking is relevant to the history? Because from what I've come across, just about the only side effect of hormones is that if you're taking masculinizing hormones, you develop a similar cardiovascular risk as a cis man, which obviously is altering. and like pancytopenia or something like that if you're a smoker. Is that it? And like other than that,
Yeah.
oh, and the only other thing as well is if your patient is taking sort of like backstreet hormones that haven't been prescribed, those can be a bit dodgy as well, and you have to check like liver function and things like that. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is like it's the hormones are not going to be the cause ever, unless it's one of those three quite niche situations. Have you come across anything different to that?
Yeah, not really. I think, like you said, when you're taking hormones, it's kind of bringing your risk profile in line with, I suppose, like a cis person's risk profile. If you have too much testosterone, then like, yeah, like you said, pancytopenia, it could be too much red blood.
I think it's polycythemia rather than pancytopenia, right? I'll look it up. I can't remember. It's one of those. Yeah.
Yeah.
Blood thing.
Yeah. Too much red blood cells.
Yeah.
And you're actually, your normal kind of GPs probably aren't going to be responsible for bringing that back down. It's only shown with clinic, unless your GP is responsible for monitoring. But in that specific scenario, then they'd be responsible for. They'd probably be in the context of them thinking about your hormones anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess that's kind of like just what I wanted to add, because I think it's an important point to note that like it is never really relevant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So your question of like, are you just being curious? The answer probably is yes.
Yeah. A lot of trans people, when they go to the doctor, to any healthcare, anything at all, they say that they get lots of inappropriate curiosity. Where just because they're trans, they get asked random questions that a lot of other people wouldn't be asked.
They can still have asthma. They can still have a heart attack. Like, yeah. Cool. I thought it was really good. I'm well chuffed with that. Do you have anything you want to add before I stop the recording?
No, I think so.
Cool. I'll stop it.